Hi, this is the July 25th meeting, 2018 of SIG Auth. So it looks like the first item on our agenda is an announcement about the Vault KMS plugin.
Hey, Mike, this is KK.
KK, do you want to take over this discussion?
Sure. Very short piece. We are talking to the HashiCorp guys right after this meeting. We're going over what we've gotten working with Vault as a provider for the KMS plugin. Once we complete the discussion, I expect to get that repo out this week. I'll update this and issue number 460 with a link to the repo once it's live. That's about it. I'm done, Mike.
Cool. Is that a KEP or was that a just a regular design proposal? I remember seeing a doc about that.
This is not going into Kubernetes. So this is just the implementation of the KMS provider we put into 1.10.
All right, cool. Looking forward to seeing the link.
Sounds good. Thank you.
The next announcement is Tim, is that separate from the Vault KMS plugin? Would you like us to do a review of the GitHub features and make sure that the milestones are up to date?
Yes.
That's around feature freeze. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sure. What is the date for feature freeze?
It is next Tuesday, the 31st.
Okay. I'll make
so to be clear, this is not code freeze. People get freaked out every release. This is, by next Tuesday, we should have issues in the features repo tracking the feature work that is being delivered, planned to be delivered for 112. So that's a link to the query filtered to our SIG, and make sure if there are things you are working on that you are intending to go into 112, that there's an issue representing that, so the release team can start coordinating with docs and announcements and tracking polls and tests and things.
Do you know what the requirements are for proposals and KEPs around feature freeze? Do they need to be merged? Do they need to be marked implementable?
I would expect, I think that's largely up to the SIGs to drive, but a good starting point would probably be for them to be implementable.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have with the dynamic audit KEP, is that in a place, we're hoping to get that in 112-ish. Is that in a spot, would I need to put an issue in here, or do I need to get that fully implementable within the KEP itself?
It's a field on the KEP. So that's kind of the last bit for people to say, yep, this API makes sense. This is a good step that we can go off and implement.
Okay.
And just to clarify a point on that, it being implementable obviously doesn't mean that the design is finished. We can still add pieces and features layered on top. It's just sort of the proposal as is kind of the minimum piece that we could implement as a standalone thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
So specifically in the context of like dynamic policy, that's something that could I think definitely be layered on at a later date.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're trying to get that out as soon as we can, but obviously it could be more of a controversial issue. So if it doesn't track 112, you know, that's not the end of the world. So.
Yep.
And you've still got the normal alpha beta stable GA flow beyond that too, right? This is just kind of for new things initially coming in to have a sense of them.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the questions I have around the KEP process actually is once you kind of have a minimum viable design and agreed on first step and then one flips to implementable, like additions from that point on, how does that work? Like, do the changes to the design get opened as PRs and then just sit there and not get merged until the change or addition is totally complete? Because otherwise you're merging things into a doc that says it can be implemented. So I don't think that's going to be answered here, but that's one question I've had about like evolving a feature.
Are KEP's designs, design proposals, or documentation of features? So yeah,
I don't know.
Right. That strategy has worked well for me in the past, but I employed it with the token request stuff, where I removed a bunch of the functionality from the original design proposal, and that allowed it to merge faster. So that might be something to consider with the dynamic audit KEP. Which segues very nicely into our next topic, which is discuss the addition of dynamic policy of audit KEP. Is there anything more we wanted to say about that? Or
I'm just trying to take minutes.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty small add to what we already merged. Obviously, it's kind of a big change there. So, I mean, there needs to be discussion around whether we think we're comfortable with that idea. The current setup is just kind of, you would have an audit configuration object. And right now we just have the webhook in there. This would just add policy to that object. So basically just saying, I can have multiple instances of this object living kind of independently. Whatever policy is within that object would just log out to that webhook, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think conceptually it's simple. This takes the implementation from a one policy to a many policy implementation, which I don't know if we want to phase the implementation to do the dynamic backends first and then tackle sort of the multi-policy aspects. Were you wanting to phase the implementation as well?
I mean, we can. I've kind of started the implementation as far as just the webhook backend. It'd be ideal, I guess, from our standpoint to have the policy as well. But I mean, we obviously need agreement across the SIGs for that. So.
A question I had raised, I think, on the original design proposal was whether, I guess there's this trade-off between implementing the policy on the client side, but the client in this case is the API server since it's pushing, or the server side, which is the receiver of the audit events. I think doing it server side means that you can do you can implement much finer grained filtering of the events if that's what you want. It means that we don't have to deal with the multi-policy complexity in the API server. It kind of skirts around the issue of dealing with aggregated API servers. On the other hand, it means that every webhook needs to go and re-implement the policy logic, and you're getting more traffic over the wire.
Yeah, and the other piece that kind of detracts, I guess, from what we're trying to do is, say you want to send out just a specific set of events to some sort of auditing service, and you don't want to expose all of your stuff to them. There's some third-party auditing service, so you just want to send out, just a specific set of events that's well scoped out to that service. Then you'd have to rely on them. There'd have to be, I guess, a trust there could be pretty finicky.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good point. You could, bounce the events through an intermediate service that does the filtering. But again, you're dealing with kind of paying the cost of those extra events and the added complexity of building that service out.
Yeah, you could proxy it. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an option. I guess it is kind of still the same boat. I don't know. It's tricky. I can definitely see there's complexity either way you go with it. It's something they don't want, I guess.
Who do you imagine would be creating these audit configurations? Would these be regular users in a namespace, maybe forwarding events in a namespace that they own to their audit backend, or would these be privileged cluster operators or cluster administrators?
So, I mean, definitely for this iteration, I just saw it as privileged cluster operators. I knew there was kind of a desire to have namespace level that got just incredibly complex trying to do that. I don't want to try and tackle that at the moment. I can definitely see the use of that, but the complexity level becomes really high in the API server trying to kind of make sense of that. So this iteration is just looking at, you have a highly privileged cluster admin level user, and they're just dynamically configuring, auditing services, external to Kubernetes.
I would be interested in analysis of how this impacts the SLO of audit, and if we discussed what our SLO for audit webhook is. For example, what does it mean to drop audit events?
I'm not sure on that. I mean, there's the existing webhook now. I guess we would, be obliged to whatever that SLO is. I'm not certain what that is at the moment.
I think one of the key differences, which was a kind of simplification decision we made in the initial proposal, was that the dynamic webhooks must be buffered and non-blocking, which means that they can't get to the same SLO point as the statically configured webhook.
Do you mean as far as failure policies, Tim? Like if delivery of the audit event fails, we will not block the request as a result.
Yeah, right.
That excludes certain use cases for the dynamic audit, I would imagine. Or is that true of just webhook audit in general?
Webhook audit can be buffered or unbuffered.
Okay. Dynamic webhook audit must be buffered. Is that what Tim said?
Yeah. One of the reasons for that is if you allow it to be blocking and you misconfigure your webhook, you've essentially hosed the cluster without some mechanism to kind of unstick it.
And another is now you have n dynamic webhooks, and if one of them fails, your cluster is hosed.
I think we maybe still should consider that as an option, just because, I mean, if you were to document it well, that people understand if you're configuring this webhook, you could potentially lock yourself out. But I could see facilities that would potentially require that. I don't know. There's definitely a risk involved. I mean, there is precedence with admission control dynamic admission control doing that.
Yeah, although dynamic admission takes steps to, like it excludes itself from being governed by dynamic admission. And it gives you options in the object itself to let you exclude like the namespace containing your dynamically hosted admission plugin. So there are some built-in protections and some protections available to the person defining the admission plugin to prevent deadlock scenarios.
That's interesting. Okay. I mean, I definitely don't think it's something we need to tackle right now. So I guess we could just see if the use case pops up down the line where people really need dynamic, unbuffered webhooks, and that's something we could, potentially look at.
I know for the rule evaluation, like when you're going through the API pipeline and deciding whether to put particular information into the audit event on the request context, right now we have, like it checks against the configured policy to see if a particular verbosity level is required or particular namespace or resource or user or group or whatever all the dimensions of the policies are. And I know some benchmarking was done on that with a single policy. When we have multiple policies in play, the thing that is responsible for delivering these events to the webhooks is going to have to evaluate all the rules on all the policies to see if any of them require a particular level of verbosity. And then when it is delivering those events, I think it's either going to have to reevaluate those rules or it's going to have to track more information about which levels of verbosity applied to which webhooks. So we would definitely want to benchmark with multiple policies, with multiple rules, like how that impacts evaluation and space as far as what we're having to track on the request context. That's why I was asking about phasing the implementation, just because the single policy implementation seems way simpler to reason about and much closer to the stuff we've already benchmarked.
Sure, yeah.
So one of the simplifications we made in the initial proposal was that the dynamic webhooks would always receive metadata level events, if I'm remembering correctly. So if we stick with that simplification, then the problem that Jordan just mentioned, I'm less worried about.
Wait, were you saying they would only ever log on the metadata level?
Yeah.
That would be, that'd be tricky, at least for our goals. We're definitely looking for request response level there. I can see how it might slow things down, but it seems like that could be more of a warning.
Back to what Jordan mentioned before, I had a question on that. Jordan, do you think this is more complex or less complex than the reverse indexing that the watch that is implemented in to support watch in the API server? Because I see some similarities.
For watch, we have a lot more dimensions.
Right.
And watches are always scoped to a single resource type. So you also have lower cardinality on the number of subscribers for a particular event. So for both of those reasons, this seems more complex. Also, you have multiple levels of delivery. So when you're delivering a watch event, the decision is just thumbs up or thumbs down, like, does this go to this watcher? Whereas with audit, it's, does this go to this watcher and with what degree of information? So you're not just delivering the same content to all watchers. Or I guess to Tim's point, one of the simplifying assumptions was we would be delivering the same content to all watchers. And if we wanted that to change, like to give metadata to some and full requests to others and full response to yet others, then yeah, that's another dimension that is more complex than watch.
Sorry, so I just went back to the proposal, and I think I was mixing up the dynamic webhook and the pull-based audit events proposal.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. I didn't remember that piece originally, but I could have misread it. Suppose.
Yeah, so it's the pull-based audit events that is doing the metadata only assumption. But that does raise an interesting point then for this proposal of how it would deal with aggregated API servers. Right now, the assumption is that the API servers that deal with different types have different policies so that they're doing whatever they need to do to deal with the types that they know about. But if you had a policy per dynamic webhook, I imagine they would all be expecting to use the same policy.
Yeah, I would actually kind of expect this to work like a dynamic or webhook admission, where you're defining the types that are going to come to your admission webhook with one policy object, and then all the API servers that run the webhook admission plugin will drive themselves via that policy. And so whether that's the Kube API server for Kube API types or some other extension API server, similarly, each API server would be running, that enables this audit mechanism could feed off the same policy. And so the Kube API server would look at an audit policy that says, I want to know about all types, and it would send request response audit events for Kube API types. And the extension API server would look at that same policy and say, well, I'm going to send request response audit events for my API types. That's what I was expecting, but if that isn't what other people are thinking, that'd be good to nail down.
That's what I would expect too, that you should build it as an extension API server, read a policy and just ignore types that you don't have.
That could actually be an optimization, right? So if in your policy you say, I want to know about these types for the extensions group and these types for the apps group and this types for the acme.com group, well, the Kube API server can discard the groups that it doesn't serve for at least the request response phases. It doesn't have to continuously evaluate those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right now, I think just to set up audit in the common case, we just set up audit on the main aggregator API server and just log metadata level for the other type. So one option is if an API server gets a request for a type it doesn't know about, it just maxes out at metadata level, even if the policy describes request.
I think that's what you would actually get already, because it would hit the metadata phase, it would populate that bits of the audit event, and then the other phases would never get triggered because it doesn't actually have the handler for that. So I think you get that for free.
Yeah, okay.
So Patrick, it sounds like there's not necessarily disagreement about letting the policy be per webhook or different per webhook, but if we're looking at something like an actual deliverable for the 112 timeframe, getting both of those implemented seems aggressive to me. I'm not sure what Tim would think.
I can understand. I mean, if we did put more resources towards it, is that something y'all would be comfortable with? Or is this, the dynamic policy piece something we need to pass by, SIG Arch or
My guess would be it would mostly be impact on API machinery for making sure the pieces that need to be dynamically evaluable are plumbed correctly, and then like involvement from SIG scalability to make sure that the testing that we've already done, we know how this impacts it, and we know whether the impact is acceptable or not. So I just to get something usable earlier, I'd like to see kind of the first phase go in, and then kind of queue up the dynamic policy bit. But I don't know what other people think.
I think we're probably good on that. We can definitely focus on just that first piece. I think that is a good sized chunk. Get that in there, get it benchmarked, and then get with SIG, API machinery and scalability, and kind of talk to him about the policy piece, and just track that as we go. Things go super quick, maybe squeeze it in there. Otherwise, just track it down the line.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And just kind of keep in mind the eventual goal of adding the policy when you're factoring in the code and whatnot.
Yep. A couple questions, and real quick. If say I configure a webhook dynamically and there's no policy statically configured through a flag, nothing would happen, right?
Is that what happens today with the, I guess, is it even possible to configure flag? I guess you would enable this audit backend explicitly on the command line. It would probably be an error currently to say you want this and not specify a policy file.
Okay, so that'd be the expected there.
I think if you say you want this and you don't specify a policy file, we probably should not start. Like that seems like a mistake rather than something useful to let them do.
Okay, I didn't know if maybe we wanted metadata level, but that could be confusing as well.
Yeah, I think there was validation added that you have to have a policy file if you're setting up audit. Yeah, I agree that I would expect this to work the same way.
Okay.
At least until we have dynamic policy. One more question I wanted to raise on the dynamic policy is if we allow the policy to raise the audit level above the static policy, then we get into this kind of funny thing where you can set up a audit webhook that exports secret data, for instance. And is that something that we're okay with from a security perspective? Because it basically means that the ability to configure an audit webhook gives you read access for all resources in the cluster.
Yeah, that's something I called out in the cap. It was kind of leaked resources that this is pretty much as high as you could go on the admin status in the cluster. Options being to either just document that well or provide some sort of, override that you can't ever go above a statically configured policy. I think we ran into, when we initially explored that, we ran into some issues, just some strange edge cases around trying to do that.
If we said that you can't ever go above the static policy, that also mitigates some of the scalability concerns we talked about. On the other hand, it kind of eliminates a use case where you want to add auditing for a custom resource type that you added in.
Yeah, or debug audit logging. Like
Yeah.
one of the things I would be super interested to use this for is we're seeing a weird issue in this one namespace in this one condition. So let me bump up to full details about this namespace and drive my use case and then disable it. Like that would be incredibly useful.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think the other kind of confusing thing that came up in discussion before was that you can't really say whether one audit policy is more or less restrictive than another because there's multiple dimensions by which you can restrict them. So it might be that you want to restrict which namespaces can be logged, or you might want to restrict which level can be logged at. Sort of it's sort of non-intuitive to add the restriction.
Yeah, I think if we want a way to limit it, an all or nothing type of, the all or nothing today is, do you even enable this dynamic mechanism? Once there's the ability to specify per dynamic webhook policy, just letting the person running the cluster decide if they want to allow that or not seems, because they're the ones who know how are they protecting write access to the API driving this, right? If that's closely held and they only let super users write to this already, then it's fine. If they are letting users use this to tap into existing audit events, then they might want to keep it pinned to their predefined policy. So like an all or nothing thing would probably be a good starting point if we wanted to let it be limited.
Alternatively, you could have a separately configured static configuration that is either ANDed or nodded against the dynamically configured policies.
Yeah.
An easy way of dealing with the question of whether a policy is more restrictive is to just build it up with the static policy and then drop things based on the dynamic policy.
Yeah. So the one that accumulates audit events and content is the static policy, and then you take that and run it against your dynamic ones. Yeah.
What gets confusing there is, yeah, I mean, the issue of debugging where you do want to turn something up, but you don't want to, have to turn it up in the static file or necessarily have that logged all the time in the static file.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we can't support both use cases at the same time. So I think we don't want degrees of freedom that don't serve specific use cases, and we want to make sure that the reasonable use cases that we can handle are handled in a pretty straightforward way. So laying those out and saying what knobs would you have to turn and what would you have to do to accomplish this, and that's a good thing to do when you're kind of building a feature like this. It can be used in a lot of different ways. So that might actually be good to add. I know the one proposing dynamic policy is the PR to the cap is really small right now, but adding like this would enable these use cases and you could do it this way might help guide some of the decisions made around.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me enhance that a little bit.
So.
I had another question around, I brought this up in SIG API machinery, but we need an informer around the configuration file. I was originally mapping towards dynamic admission, but apparently that was an exception. And the informers and clients should not be in client Go for something like this. They should actually be within the API server itself. The API server doesn't seem to have any informers generated today. Is that something I should just add in there?
They should. There are informers that we use for the other API server objects, but they might just be in a different location than where you're looking.
Okay, maybe I'm just missing them. That could be the case.
All right. Does that cover what you wanted to discuss about the audit policy, Cap?
Yeah, I think that gives us clear direction going forward. So definitely appreciate everybody jumping in, and yeah, we'll start on the basic stuff and see how far we can get with that. So, should I put a quick PR in just to get that implementable label on the cap?
Yeah, and make sure that it is on the board for API review. So one of the things we're trying to do regarding API review is let SIGs kind of decide what projects have value and what directions they want to go, and then once there are KEPs describing like why this is an important thing to do that has approval from the SIG, then it gets queued up to make sure the API makes sense. And we're trying to do like a little better job of pipelining these things and getting visibility early. So now that this has, the first stage of it has kind of gotten agreement, yeah, I would open a PR to flip it to implementable, and I will send you a link to the place where we can get that queued up for API review as well, so that we don't do last minute things trying to get something.
So yeah, I'd need to add an issue as well, I guess, over there.
We're still trying to figure out the best way to coordinate everything, but yeah, I'll point you to where we are trying to do that.
Okay, sounds
Do you
good.
have a feature yet in the features repo? Do you have a feature for this?
What was up?
Do you have a feature in the features repo for this?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I haven't seen the features repo yet.
Yeah, so try to create one before the feature freeze.
Okay, sounds good.
Jordan, did you have anything else to say about the KEP process, or were you just taking notes on what we
No, I was just trying to take notes.
All right, sounds good. That concludes our agenda. Does anybody have anything else to add? All right, then I'll end the recording.